So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Roger Ines and Amy Ines. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Radha. Delighted to have some time to spend with everybody today.
This is the Laser Interferometry Gravity Wave Observatory. In 2017, it was responsible for winning 3 Nobel Prizes. But in 1995, the Caltech managers of this project received a stop work order from the National Science Foundation. Why? Because the National Science Foundation had lost trust in what they were doing. They had asked for a work breakdown structure describing all of the construction and components that were going to go into this massive facility. And Caltech thought they could do it like a skunk works. They thought they knew what they were doing and that they didn't need to have all this complicated paperwork. But NSF needed it because they needed to know that the money was going to be well spent. More importantly, the NSF needed it because their customer, Congress, wanted to know that the money was going to be well spent. This is the biggest project that NSF had ever undertaken, and trust was very important. The manager at that point at Caltech, Robbie Vogt, didn't agree. There were some contentious meetings, and ultimately Robbie had to be replaced. His replacement, Barry Barish, rebuilt trust with the NSF. The construction started up again, the project was built, and Barry was one of the 3 people to win the Nobel Prize. Trust matters.
Yes, and Barry saved the day. Unfortunately, Robbie faced a trust moment of truth and he didn't handle it well. So our opportunity to spend time with you today is to help you learn things you can do to build trust in relationships, to create rapport with people you meet, people who are important to helping you advance your science. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about what some people think about as soft skills, relationship building and influence. But from our perspective, relationship building and influence are essential skills, especially in today's world as scientists, because you're up against alternative facts. And these 3 core elements comprise the essence of our book, Championing Science, which we wrote to help scientists learn to be more effective communicators, particularly when it comes to getting people to support your work. So think of the material today as it applies to the people who are your sponsors, your potential future sponsors, as well as your colleagues and partners. And a couple of quick housekeeping items. We're going to take questions at the end of the session, so feel free to put them in the chat window as they come up, but we're going to hold off responding to them. And everybody's on mute right now, so we're going to just take it from here. And when it comes to trust and relationships and sponsors, funding is ultimately a goal for scientists. And there are many places you can look to find science funding these days.
It's conventional to think about an agency like NSF as the sponsor that you'd be talking about. But today you have to think about many other people as a scientist. Many of you are going to work in industry and you're going to have a boss, you're going to have a structure that you have to work within that company. You could end up at a national laboratory like I am with a complex scientific structure. But there are also non-conventional government agencies. And today, increasingly important are people like venture capitalists and philanthropies. Philanthropies put $2.3 billion into American science in 2017. That's an important place for you to understand how it's going to work.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about where money's coming from, I know in a lot of work that you're doing, you're finding a lot of interest in climate change coming from philanthropies and individuals who want to have an impact.
Right, I work in climate change technology, and today a lot of those non-traditional sponsors are interested in acting in advance of government, helping government move. And a question you might ask yourself is, well, how do I get connected to those non-conventional people? It's not a call for proposals. How do I find out what they're doing? We're going to talk about that today, one of the things. An important thing is that you're often asking that person for some time. You're asking them for the gift of time. And as you know, when it's time to go to dinner and you want to take along a nice bottle of wine as a gift to take, you need to reciprocate that gift of time with something. And so what can a scientist offer a scientist offers information. Your return gift is always the information that you know that can help that person do their job. And just like going to dinner with a bottle of wine, you don't take a case of wine, do you? You want to bring the appropriate amount of information. It's a small amount. You want to cultivate and build a relationship. And as you build that relationship, you want to stay in touch and basically make that person into a friend ultimately. And we're going to talk about how to do that.
Right. But first, we'd like to ask you a question. Roger's introduced this idea of giving the gift of scientific information as a way of creating relationships and getting to know somebody. We're curious to have you answer this polling question, and it should be appearing on your screen. That over. There you go. Appearing on your screen. I use the gift of information to help build relationships with decision makers. Is that something you're doing? Is that something you do often? Is it something that you do on occasion? Or is this an idea that is new to you and you've not been thinking about relationship building from the perspective of having valuable information that could be helpful to a decision maker? Take a minute to let folks respond. And for those of you who have not been in this habit, one way to start becoming a little more in that groove is to be thinking about the things that you read and asking yourself, who else might find this of value? And taking the opportunity to send along a note and forward a link. That's really easy to do today, especially with all the various places we get information. I know you get a lot of great information from your Twitter community.
Yeah, just keeping abreast of what other people in your community are doing and being able to share that with decision makers is incredibly useful because they can't keep up, and having short snippets is very valuable.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. Paul?
Yeah, so it looks like about a third of you folks are doing that already. It's a habit you're already in, and about half of you are doing it sometimes. And it's a new idea for some of you as well. So we're glad to have introduced it. And it's the kind of opportunity as a scientist to add value in a lot of places. And as you think about the various places you want to build relationships, you start to understand what people are interested in, you can expand the things you pay attention to so that you can help cultivate the relationship through information. I have to stop sharing. Great. So now we're going to zero in on trust. And trust really is the bedrock of all strong and productive relationships. It has a bottom line impact because when you have trusted relationships and people get along well and know that they can believe in each other, you can move more quickly, you can get more done, and you can save costs. You don't have to look any further than the TSA lines today to realize just how much time and cost is impacted when trust is lost. So when it comes to trust, you want to build it strong. And we're going to share with you today some concepts that are built off of some of the work that Stephen Covey, the son of the more famous Stephen Covey, has done. He's got a book called The Speed of Trust. And I happen to like a lot of the ideas that he puts forward. I think they're very valuable to scientists. He talks about this metaphor of a tree. And when you think about what it takes to build trust, it's got a combination of both character qualities and competence. And I think the competence piece of his model is especially important for scientists. So let's talk a little bit about integrity. I love the definition, doing what's right when nobody's watching. And I think scientists have an opportunity so often to call into question their own connection to their integrity. At a lecture recently, I took a clip of this slide because it really spoke to just how many places people can go off the rails when it comes to their scientific integrity. So as a scientist, it's ongoing opportunities to make sure that you're doing the work that you do with high integrity. The trunk of the tree, that strength that keeps everything well anchored, is the notion of your intent. And I think the important thing for scientists to remember here is that unless you're explicit about your intent, unless you state what your motives are, and unless those motives are really well aligned with your sponsors, things aren't going to go as well as they can. So you want to make sure that you've thought about your intent and that you've declared it, you've been explicit. And then of course you want to make sure that what you say and what you do is well matched, because that's where trust comes from, when people can count on your word and see it play out in the actions that you take. The competence piece of this trust tree is all about the things you're capable of doing. And competence is something that can shift over time, right? I know in Roger's career, he's done a lot of different kinds of things. He's an expert in stochastic engines, and now he's involved in climate change. So scientists' careers evolve over time. And you know, all of us have our natural talents, our skills, the training that we've gotten as scientists. But I think the important part of the capabilities piece here is to be conscious of your mindset, because the things you know color the way you view the world. The level of optimism you have about your work colors the way you view the world. And then add to that your personal style, the way you come across to people, the amount of humor you use, your warmth, your patience, your calm in the face of chaos, which happens on occasion. All of those elements are part of your capabilities. And what we like to remind people is that the most effective scientists carry themselves with a kind of confident humility. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's because you have a good, strong, I would say, ego-based view of what you're good at, without being too carried away or too full of yourselves and feeling as though you know everything and you have nothing to learn. So confident humility comes with a willingness to be open, to continue to learn, to really listen to other people's ideas so that you can learn and grow. And the world we live in today, there's so many sources of new information. So I think it's especially important for scientists to earn trust by paying attention to what other people are thinking and being open to that as well. The last piece of the trust tree has to do with your results. And obviously your track record in the early days is going to be your point of entree to a decision maker and a potential sponsor. They're going to want to know what you've done before, what you and your partners potentially have done before.
Partners are important.
Partners are really important. And I know sometimes there's an equation what the right amount of partners are.
Yeah, right. But you know, when you're new in a field, you can come in with people who the sponsor already knows and work with them. That helps build your track record.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other two pieces of the results part of this equation have to do with progress and future expectations. It's really important to become meticulous about providing status reports and giving updates. The rule of thumb is no surprises. You don't ever want a sponsor to suddenly find out about something that's gone astray.
And if something is going astray, you want them to find out from you and not from somebody else.
Yes, I remember that morning you were heading off to Sacramento. You had some news to deliver.
Yeah, and we had a supplier had gone bankrupt, and we had to go right to the sponsor and say, we've got a problem, but we know how to fix it. And the sponsor was very pleased that we got the problem to them right away, and that we had an idea of how to fix it. And they were like, okay, good, go fix it. It was fine.
Yeah. So that's a case of recalibrating expectations. And it's important to think about trust building from the standpoint of your integrity, your intent, your capabilities, and paying attention to making sure that your results speak well of the work you've committed to get done. I want to touch on some behaviors here in this list that comes from some of the Kavli work. I think the ones in white are pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. The ones that are in blue really give us a launching off point to make some points for you as scientists that we think are really important. When it comes to showing loyalty, that's your opportunity to make sure you give credit to the other people who are involved in a project. When you can do that in front of a sponsor, it's a trust building behavior. Another correlated behavior is having the integrity to have a conversation with somebody about something that isn't working instead of talking behind their back. One way you can erode trust with a sponsor is if you're complaining about a colleague or somebody else involved in a project, If you're willing to say that to the person themselves, then you can certainly take that input to the sponsor. Let the sponsor know, hey, I've had a conversation with Joanne. Here are the things that I think she needs to shift. She's agreed. We're going to be on track now. But you don't want to be bad-mouthing Joanne without making it clear that you've given her that feedback as well. That's important for building trust. The notion of getting better is one that we talk a lot about in our book. We talk about the concept of being self-aware and getting feedback. You know, we can think we know how we're coming across, but sometimes if we haven't asked, we might be wrong. So asking for feedback, making a point of checking in with people to see if the message you're delivering is one they understand clearly or understand the way you intend it, is a really important part of building strong, trusted relationships, because that's where miscommunication can happen, when you're not checking in and when you think you may have been understood a certain way, and perhaps that's not been the case.
It's always a good idea in front of a sponsor to have someone else there with you who's just listening and watching the sponsor and seeing how it went across, and talk to them later and say, how did it work?
Yeah.
You always get lost when you're talking. That's understandable.
Yeah. And the last item that we wanted to dive into for a minute here is the notion of confronting reality. For me, when I think about scientists, and I'm working with a group of specialty scientists who are developing new materials, and you know, things don't always work. You are in uncharted territory. This particular company is, you know, working with customers who are looking for these products. So there's a lot of pressure in their organization to create these new materials and to get prototypes developed. But reality might say things aren't working. So, you know, the advice here is don't ever try to go solo when you run into a problem. Be comfortable enough saying, here's what I'm up against. Here's how I'm thinking about solving it. What do you think? Have you got any ideas? Enlist your colleagues. And it's okay also to talk about it with your sponsor.
A good sponsor can be trusted. Just like you want them to trust you, you need to trust them.
Yes. And last but not least, you know, trust is something you build over time. It's a series of activities, behaviors, deliverables, connections, where sponsors know they can count on you. You want to always be sure that you're keeping your commitments. So we've talked about trust behaviors. Let's talk about how you build trust when you're suddenly up in front of somebody new for the first time, giving a presentation or in a meeting. You might be wondering about the violin player here. Well, he's here to let us all see what it looks like when you're confident, when you have a passion for what you're doing, when you're in command, when you have the warmth of a smile. All of those qualities together help you show up as somebody who can be trusted. So as you think about making your first impression, walk into a room with a bit of a lilt in your step. Make sure that your head is up, that you're looking at people, and hold yourself in good posture. That kind of open, strong stance exudes confidence, and confidence helps people build trust in you. It's also important to come across in a way that's consistent. And what I mean here is that there's an alignment between the way you're speaking, the gestures you're making, the expressions on your
Nice
face,
gestures, Amy.
and the words you're saying. And I could look at Roger and say, I'm really excited to be here today, Dr. Ains. I want to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing with this new helmet technology that
She doesn't seem very excited, does she?
Is going to help with concussions, versus I'm really excited to be here today. Our team has had some great results in the lab. I want to share a little bit of data. We've got some exciting developments around protecting young athletes from concussions. Very different energy, very different tone. There's a lilt in my voice. There's a smile on my face. I'm more animated and I'm showing excitement. Well, you might be wondering, well, what if your natural style is much more quiet and subdued?
Well, it still counts to be just a little more animated than you might be. And always pay attention to looking people in the eye and paying attention to not looking shifty, you know, not looking away, which always makes you seem uncertain.
Right, and eye contact is a really important aspect of building trust. So we're going to talk a little bit about making good eye contact. It's the opportunity to connect with people, but to do it in a way where it's comfortable. And on average, people are comfortable when you've looked at them in the eye for about 3 or 4 seconds. You wouldn't want to go much longer than 9. That begins to feel like I'm staring at you. And what if it's just 2 of us and we're having a conversation? You want to be attentive, you want to pay attention, but you want to break eye contact for just a second or 2 and then return to being connected so that you're not in a stare down kind of a situation. And the right time to make eye contact is when you're listening to a person talk. If they stop talking and they're contemplating something, you should look away. Because if you're looking at them and they're busy thinking, you put this kind of unspoken pressure on them to come up with an answer and to return to the conversation. So giving them the space to think is a really important part of making effective eye contact. What about in front of an audience? You can apply similar concepts here. We like to talk about the idea of conversational eye contact, where you're looking at a particular person in the eye, connecting with them. And even if you can't see people, even if the setting of the room is one where it's dark, just imagine you're having a conversation with one person at a time.
Like we're imagining having a conversation with you right now.
Looking you in the eye and then delivering a thought for a few seconds and then shifting your gaze to somebody else in the room. So those are some tips around making eye contact. The idea being that looking people in the eye creates connection. Doing it in an appropriate way helps build a sense of connected trust.
So where's the science in all this? When do you get a chance to present your science? Remember that we're talking about talking to a non-specialist decision maker. We're not talking about talking to your major professor or somebody who's deeply knowledgeable, but somebody who really wants to know the overview of what you're doing. But you still need to give them one deep dive. You need to go all the way to the bottom of your science just once. And by just once, we really mean probably just 1 view graph or 2. But you need to give them a lot of detail. Why do you want to do that when they might not understand it? Well, first, they expect it. You're scientists, people expect us to do that to them. Second is that in the audience, there's likely to be someone who is a specialist. And they're going to think, well, Roger doesn't know what he's talking about because he didn't give any details. But if you overdo it, if you give them 20 slides of details, if you bring a case of wine instead of a bottle, then you're going to overwhelm them and you're going to waste their time and they're going to lose attention. But one deep dive can keep that attention and get them basically to know that you're a really competent scientist. It's very important to, when you're talking to a decision maker, to understand what their agenda is, what they want to accomplish. Try to look it up ahead of time, try to talk to people ahead of time, ask them questions. When you walk into a meeting with someone, it's always fine to say, what would you like to get out of this meeting? But pay attention to their agenda and don't drag them off in a direction that you know they don't want to go. You're wasting their time and yours if you do that. If you're not building a trusted relationship with someone, you end up in the position that Dan Kahneman described. He won the Nobel Prize for economics, and for basically understanding how people communicate. And the message from him that I love is that if people don't trust you, it doesn't matter how much evidence you supply, it won't make any difference. They won't listen to you. You have to build trust, and you have to pay attention to building it gradually, because it doesn't come all at once. You can't just walk in and hand someone your scientific paper and expect that they're going to trust you on the topic. You have to build it up from the beginning. So let's talk about how you build up that trust.
So that takes us to the topic of rapport. Rapport is that opportunity you have when you first meet somebody to create a connection. And when you have rapport, you have this sense that you hit it off, that you've clicked, that it's easy to talk, that you have common interests, and that you understand each other. So rapport building is a really valuable aspect of creating relationships. Trust is something you have to do over time. Rapport is something you can do the minute you connect with somebody and every time you connect with them. So we want to give you some perspective on how to do that. And the power of rapport is that it paves the way for you to collaborate effectively and create things together. And I don't know about you, but I have certain partners that I've worked with over the years. And when we work on something together, there's just this, something flows, something works. We're our best selves together. And that's when you know you've got really, really strong rapport. And it is something you can learn how to do. So we're going to talk about a couple of situations that are common in the world of science, and dive in a little bit to the rapport building opportunity you have, starting with being at a poster session. So at a poster session, you know, if you're lucky enough, people will stop by and strike up a conversation with you. Sometimes you have to engage them and bring them in. But if they come up, the first thing you want to do is look them in the eye. You want to shake hands. You want to have a really warm smile. So what's a warm smile? Well, it's not a smile where you just turn up the corners of your mouth. It's a smile you can feel all the way to your eyes. It's a real smile. And engaging people with your warmth helps to begin building rapport.
I don't know about you, but I'm always glad when somebody walks up to my poster. So I don't have any trouble putting a big smile on for them. I'm happy they're there.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing to do to start to create rapport in a poster setting is to try to get a sense of what somebody's interested in. Instead of launching into your whole poster spiel, figure out where they are. Start by saying, so what is it about my topic you're interested in? And when you hear that answer, it's a launching point for you to ask another question. Well, help me understand, you know, how you come to this. Are you studying it? Have you been in this research area for a while? Try to gauge what level of expertise they have, because then you can figure out what level of language to bring to them. And there's a little bit of an adjusting process as you listen and you watch their facial expression. You'll be able to sense whether you're hitting the right level of detail. So that's how you start to build rapport in a poster session. And if you end up in a situation where you're talking to Roger and somebody else comes along, that can feel a little bit awkward. So how do you deal with that? Well, let's say Roger's a potential sponsor. You don't necessarily want to invite the other person into that conversation because this one is really important to you. So what you can say to that person, you can acknowledge them, smile at them, create a sense of rapport, but say, Roger and I are going to need another 5 minutes or so. Could you please join me later? I'd be happy to talk with you about my work. Send them on their way. Or the flip side, if you're just chatting with Roger and I just started chatting. I was just telling him about this. You're welcome to join us. So take the opportunity to connect with people who come up to you so that they don't have to feel awkward standing there. Yeah, acknowledge them, say hello, and create that first opportunity to build some rapport. What about meet and greet situations? And those come up often if you're giving a talk somewhere. We always tell people, get there early. And if we could have, we would have been walking around saying hello to all of you because that's what we recommend. Yeah. Take the opportunity to introduce yourself as today's speaker, find out why somebody has come and is interested in sitting and listening to you, strike up a conversation. And the beauty of doing that is not only does it create rapport with a few people you can then look at in the audience, but it helps you feel a little more connected to a group of people who might otherwise have all been strangers.
And for those of you who are introverts like me, it's really easy to walk up to someone and say, hi, I'm the speaker. It's an easy opening for anyone.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about strategic relationships, intentional relationships, the ones that are going to help advance your science. And that brings us to our second poll. And the question is about building rapport. We're curious to know, does building rapport come naturally to you? And some of you may have a good sense of that, whether it's yes or no, and some of you might not have really stopped to think about it. So we gave you the not sure option. And as you're answering that question, we thought it would be fun to help you understand how this webinar came to be. And it came to be because as Roger and I were working with University of California Press and getting ready to publish our book, we were talking about the Alda Center as an organization we wanted to be connected to. The work that Radha is doing, that Laura Lindenfeld, the director's doing, just felt so aligned with what we're passionate about. So it was really natural to us to think about connecting and wanting to build a relationship. So I reached out, had a great phone conversation with Laura. And during that call, she said, hey, maybe after your book is out, we can work on a webinar together. So that's part of how today came to be. But the other part of the rapport building is a fun story. Roger and I were at the AAAS conference in DC in February, and Rada let us know that she couldn't make it. She was in Alaska, but that Laura was going to be there. So we got a chance to meet her, and we planned to have breakfast together. And as we were leaving our Marriott, walking down to the restaurant, Roger made a comment about the hotel. I think, what was the word?
I said it was a little grim.
Yeah. And Laura immediately jumped on that, and she said, I'm so glad you said that. She said, I've stayed in a lot of Marriotts too, and this one definitely needs a facelift. So that was one of those little bits of conversation, not about the weather, thankfully, but about something in common. And it got better from there. We were walking to the restaurant, which happened to be next to a place called the Gin Joint, which we had stopped into the night before to have a cocktail. And we were telling Laura how we'd found this breakfast place. Come to find out, she and Roger are both gin lovers.
I prefer to think gin aficionados.
Well, and that's probably true because they started exchanging favorite gins, and they were these very distinctive, unusual gins that they'd had a chance to sample. So, gin is not usually your breakfast conversation, but as it turned out, it became a really fun way for us to all connect and create some warmth and really be connected as people first before we started talking about the business of the day. So just trying to see those results here. It looks like many of you feel pretty good about your rapport skill building.
All the training, good job.
Which is terrific. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are so many of the principles that I know are part of the work that the Alda Center's been doing. So it's great to see that you've got a good read on rapport. We're going to talk just for a couple minutes about rapport and conversations. The example we just gave you about our chance to connect with Laura was, taking a genuine interest in each other, also finding common ground like a grim hotel and the love of gin, sharing experiences with people, something that you're going through together gives you a topic of conversation. Asking open-ended questions, and one of my favorites at conferences. So tell me about something really interesting that you learned today.
She'll do that to people in the elevator, and I think it's terrific.
I know. He's watching me going, I can't believe you just did that.
But they love it. People love that.
and I learned things, and we had some really fun chance meetings with people because I struck up elevator conversations. So being empathetic to the people that you meet, sharing a laugh, an appropriate laugh, is also another way of creating connection that helps to instantly build rapport through conversation. The other thing to keep in mind about rapport building is the way a conversation develops over time. And here I like to think about a tennis volley when people are really evenly matched. You're hitting back and forth, pretty similar speed. The level and topics of your conversation are well matched. And when it comes to connecting to a new sponsor, let them take the lead on the topics they bring up. If they mention something about family, it's okay for you to mention something about family, but let them be the one who takes the conversation into more of a personal realm. Thinking back to the notion of, having common ground. If they direct you in a direction, feel free to reciprocate by talking about the topic that they've introduced. We had an interesting experience at this same conference, happened to meet a couple, and it turned out she was also a book author. And in the first few minutes of sitting down with them, David let us know that his wife, Carla, had written a book. And she told us it was a book about hypochondria. And she said, yeah, there's a personal connection to it, but she didn't elaborate. And I knew not to ask. And our conversation went on, and it really focused on our common ground, which was the fact that we were authors and we'd had an experience getting a book published. Well, I read her book, and the personal connection was about this tragic accident when she was 19. She was driving, and her friend in the passenger seat was killed in a car accident. And had she told us that, it would have absolutely changed the nature of our conversation. It would have catapulted us into a really emotional, heavy topic that would have been uncomfortable for having just met this woman minutes before. So think about that tennis volley, keep your topics evenly matched. take an even amount of time talking and listening too. You don't want to be the one dominating the conversation when you're meeting somebody for the first time. Now we want to talk a little bit about something else that I know the Alda Center knows well, and the notion of mirroring in improv is one where you are so in sync with the person you're mirroring that it's hard to tell who's leading and who's following. When it comes to rapport building, that would be going a bit too far. That would make somebody feel like you're playing copycat and you're mimicking them. So what we like to recommend is that you notice and that you find a way where you feel comfortable being a little chameleon-like. So if Roger's leaning forward and I'm talking with him, I can lean forward just a little bit. If the pace of his speech is slower than mine, I can slow mine down just a little bit. So show up authentically as the person that you are, but also recognize that we like people who are like us. And by finding a couple of ways to match the cadence of the person that you're with really helps build rapport. I still have a very vivid memory of a meeting 20 years ago with the man who is our executive vice president of human resources, John Writing. This is for a company called AirTouch. And John was one of the most mild-mannered, genteel people I've ever worked with. And as you can tell, I'm a pretty animated, enthusiastic person. And the minute I got in the room, I was excited about the communications project I was presenting to him, but I very quickly found there was such a gap between his energy and mine that I just instinctively found myself slowing down and being a little more soft-spoken. And it wasn't like I was copying him. It was just I was trying to create a level of comfort between the two of us, and I was tuning into his style and shifting mine a little bit. So think about that as an opportunity when you're meeting people to recognize if you sense a gap between how you're coming across and how they're coming across. Think about ways you're comfortable to bridge that gap.
So we've talked a lot about how to build trust and how to build relationship, rapport with the sponsor, but ultimately we're all very interested in actually getting the decision maker to do what we want them to do, to fund their project, to take an action. How do we get them to do that? Well, as scientists, we tend to think, I'm going to build the case, I'm going to put the case in front of them, I'm going to have all the science, all the engineering right, and then they're going to say, oh, I see exactly what needs to happen, and they're going to do it. Well, it doesn't work like that. You do need to do that, that's true, but there are other things that you need to have the sponsor end up thinking and feeling. You want them to be excited about your work. Your goal would be to have the decision maker go home and tell people at dinner about the exciting thing they heard today. So excitement is really valuable. You want them to be confident in what you've told them. This is more than just trusting. This is confident that you'll be able to deliver. If you're proposing a project, you need them to think that they're actually going to come in on time, on budget, that you will be a good steward of their money. And finally, this is one that people don't think about. This decision maker needs to be able to act on the thing that you're asking them to do. It needs to be inside their realm of authority. So you need to pay attention to what that is. What does this person do? Are you talking to the right person, or should you just be asking for advice from this person because you need to talk to someone else? And this comes back to a final thing that you should always think about when talking to a decision maker, and that is always ask them for something. It sounds a little funny, but a decision maker gives you their time because they expect you to ask for something. If you don't ask for it, you're wasting their time. Maybe it's a simple ask. Maybe it's, what do you think of this idea? Or maybe it's, would you please fund my $50,000 project? But at any rate, you should always think at the end of the conversation about making the ask. Make the ask every time. When we discuss our ideas in front of seminars in college and in university, we're often defending, and we often think that the audience is throwing spears and arrows at us, and we have to fend them off and get all the details right, and it's an adversarial relationship. It's not true in front of a decision maker. You can put away the Danish warriors and think about teaching. In front of a decision maker, your idea is to start from the basics, to make sure that they understand why what you're talking about is important, and to build it up from that background carefully and slowly, and pay attention to whether they're understanding. definition of influence is not that you're hammering the information into someone's head, but that you're motivating them to want to have the information. You're building their interest. You're developing their ability to understand what you're doing, and you're making them excited about learning to do it. You're guiding and motivating. Influence is not an event. Influence is a process. It's a thing that you think about developing slowly. In my work with scientists over the years, I've spent a lot of time going to meetings and talking to people about what's important. What do you think matters? When you have a decision maker, you get a few minutes with them, ask them what they think they would like to have. What's the thing they're missing today? You often hear about an elevator speech, and you do need to have your short speech of what your science is ready to go, but don't break it out in an elevator, for heaven's sake. If you get into an elevator with the project sponsor for your area, you have 15 seconds with them, ask them a question. Ask them what they learned today. Ask them what's important to them. Ask them what they need that they don't have. And when they answer you, you now have something really valuable to build on. The next time you see that person, you can say, you know, remember, John, when we were in the elevator, I was thinking about what you said, being a respectful person, and I've come back to you with an idea that I think you might find useful. What do you think about this? That gives you an opportunity to discuss it with them, to find out how they think about it, and to build your idea with their input. You want it to become part of their world. So you can't just feed it into their head. You need to let them think about it. And a couple of different meetings is usually the way that you do that. But you often don't get the time in front of the decision maker that you really want. You think, if I only had an hour in front of the head of the program, I could convince him that what I'm doing is just exactly right for him. Well, guess what? You get 10 minutes, and that's if you're lucky. But you can take advantage of their inner circle. If you work with people that the decision maker trusts, you get to spend a lot more time with them. They're trusted advisors, in particular, the CTO of a corporation who will be able to influence the chief executive officer. If you spend your time with them, you get to do two things that are really useful. First, you get a lot more of their time, because that's their job, is to find out what scientists like you know and be able to transmit it to the decision maker. But also, you have a chance to adjust your message. If you talk to an advisor and the advisor says, well, that's not really what we're looking for. What we're looking for is this. You have a chance to go home and say, oh, well, okay, my idea wasn't far off from that, but I'm going to change it so that it's close to what they have. Being inside that moat, inside that trusted sphere of influence, is extremely important. And it's a much more valuable thing to you than just thinking, oh, I'm going to get with the decision maker and I'm going to convince them. Usually you won't, because they're going to turn to their advisors and say, what do you think of this, about this? If the advisor doesn't have an opinion, you're already done. This idea of a trusted third-party endorsement is an incredibly powerful thing in science. You should be talking to your science with all kinds of other people all the time. I share everything that we do at my laboratory. Some people think that their science needs to be really secretive and they need to keep it to themselves. Well, then you're losing a lot of other allies. You're losing people who would speak up for you when a decision maker asks. And what about that thing that Roger Ains was talking about? And that somebody else can say, well, yeah, that was a pretty good idea, I thought. Much more powerful than you going in and talking about it. And you can do the same for other people as well. If you go into a decision maker and he says, you know, what I'm really thinking about is carbon and soil. That's the thing I really need to know about. And you're able to say, oh, well, have you talked to Jane? Jane has a terrific idea about carbon and soil. You immediately make yourself into a more trusted source. And you've helped your friend Jane. This is good on both counts. But that third-party exchange of information is much more powerful than you just making a proposal on your own.
So you can see why building relationships to advance your science is such a rich opportunity. And I want to talk a little bit before we wrap up about influence styles, because there are different ways to exert influence, different ways to communicate from an influence perspective. And this model has 5 elements to it. The negotiating piece is one that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, just to say, when you get to the point where you're deciding to do a project with someone, yes, there's some logical negotiation time, right? You're going to figure out the win-win, decide how to scope the project. When it comes to building new relationships, smaller projects are better. because if you can be sure you can deliver, you can start to build that track record of trust with someone. So don't be afraid to break things into smaller pieces so that you can start to negotiate and deliver and prove that you can be counted on. So I want to spend a little time on the advocating and uniting concepts. And as I do, I want you to think about, where do you naturally go? What's your natural style when you're trying to influence people? The notion of asserting is one where you push your ideas, where the power resides in you and your scientific expertise. The idea that you might say to somebody, well, that's not going to work, but I'm 100% sure that if we do it this way, it's going to work.
You've heard that, haven't you?
I imagine you have. That's a really common position, especially when you're sitting around the table trying to solve a problem, right? People have strong assertions about their science. The other common influence style in this advocating arena is to rationalize. And that's where the power lies within your data and your research. And you'll cite the statistics and, dig up all the information that you have that reinforces the position that you're advocating. The other two styles are more uniting in their nature. And these are two styles that are really important to use, but not oftentimes used, or at least not consciously used by scientists. The notion of inspiring somebody with your science is the what if you could question, right? And I have a company I'm working with that's developing a new drug for sickle cell disease. And, for them to walk in and talk about, potential investors about the prospect of this new drug, voxelotor, they say things like, what if we could stop the progression of sickle cell disease at 9 months of age, right at the time that fetal hemoglobin wanes and a child runs the risk, if they've got the genetics, to have this horrible disease. I don't know how much you know about sickle cell, but people with sickle cell have 20 to 30 years taken off their life. It's a devastating disease. So the ability to inspire and compel comes from asking those kinds of questions, helping your sponsor see the potential future. What if we could solve this problem together? What would that do? So that's where you are from an inspiring perspective.
That's something I often spend time doing in my climate technology work is saying to people, what if we could do this thing? And people are very open to that. Then you start a conversation. Then you start finding out where you have shared ground, where the decision maker is willing to act.
And that brings up the other influence style, the connecting style. And there you're operating from a place of relationship, the connection that you have to someone of common interest for getting things done. And if you're influencing somebody and you're in the connecting style, you might say something like, clearly we are all interested in trying to get this work done. Let's figure out how to leverage the laboratory skills and what's going on with your corporate commitment to this problem. So you're operating with the relationship at the core. And this also brings to mind the idea of bringing in other players. Who else can be connected to this? And here in the connecting mode is where you show your empathy and your care toward your sponsor. You really want to understand the problem they're trying to solve. You really want to walk in their shoes. That creates a sense of connection as you're working to share information to influence an outcome. So all of these styles are important. What's interesting is that the advocating styles, which I think scientists are typically most comfortable with, work really well with somebody who's knowledgeable about the facts and the specifics. But we've just said to you, that's often not the case with a decision maker. So if you don't already have fluency in all of these styles, think about how you drive influence. Think about the conversations you want to have as you get to know a sponsor and build relationships, and draw upon these various influence styles to help you get there. So we're going to put up our very last polling question. I asked you to give some thought to which of these styles is your most natural go-to style of influence. And if you could, let us know whether it's asserting or rationalizing, or perhaps you're somebody who does a lot of uniting in the way that you try to advance your science. I have a hypothesis here. We'll see if my hunch is right.
Oh, not too many bossy listeners on this webinar. That's good.
All right, so far it's looking good. Rationalizing is in the lead, bouncing around at 40%. Yeah, it's just such a natural place for scientists to go in the way that you talk about what you do. And it's absolutely an important place to be. I mean, as we've said, the facts are important. But remember, people respond to you based on the connection they feel. They respond based on your enthusiasm. Emotions are contagious. When you're excited about something you're doing and you can let that show, when you can help inspire someone to see the possibilities born out of your own experience and excitement, it's quite powerful. So we highly recommend that you get familiar with these various influence styles and think about the most appropriate time and place to bring them to bear as you're working with new sponsors.
So how can you act on all this advice that we've given you? Pay attention. Pay attention to what your audience is getting from you. Try to get into discussion with people. Check in. Always be informal whenever you can. And ultimately, make yourself into a better relationship builder and into a more influential scientist.
And with that, we're going to dive into the chat window. We also have a collection of a few resources for you that you'll find on our Championing Science site under book webinar resources. There's some additional reading material about trust and some of the information we've just covered in the influence styles. So you can find all of that on our website. And Radha was going to be good enough to take a look at some of our polling questions, and we'll turn it over to you if there are any that you want to start with, and we'll take a look at them as well. So we have a question from a young woman in the physical sciences and who's struggling and feeling like she's fighting a bit of an uphill battle to connect on a personal level, particularly with more senior people who happen to be male in her organization. So, you know, this is a challenging situation for many young scientists, in part because there's a power difference, right? When you're working with somebody, you're a young scientist, and you're working with somebody who's been at it for a while. You know, people have sort of a mythic sense about them. And it can be especially difficult when you're a young woman and you're working with a male scientist. You know, I worked with a lot of scientists and technologists over the years. And in my very early career days, I was involved in T1 multiplexing. So I faced this a lot. And what I found was the most valuable part of building rapport was information sharing, was really helping somebody know that I understood the subject matter and I had something to contribute around the science specifics. Starting there was a great starting point. And over time, as you are traveling with people and you have shared experiences, look for opportunities to chat about that and build rapport with neutral shared experiences. And then let that tennis volley take you to those next levels of relationship when you start to talk a little bit about your family or the new car you just bought. And that happens over time. But starting from the place of your capabilities and competence as a young scientist is always an ideal way to go.
And I have a trick for you that I've used for 35 years and it works every time. Senior people love to be asked for advice. If you say, I have a difficult problem and I would like to get some advice from you on how to solve it, you will get time from almost anyone. You might only get a few minutes, you might get an hour, but the point is senior people worked hard to become experts and they appreciate the fact that you want their help. So asking someone for advice is always a way to start building a relationship. So the next question is, how do you balance apparently opposite goals of appealing to your listeners' personhood, rapport, using examples, while also appealing to their job holderhood by keeping it short? Oh boy, that's like choosing which bottle of wine to take to dinner too. There is a little bit of art, and that's why we love the phrase self-aware and self-correcting. Sometimes you just have to try it out and see how it works. And I spend a lot of time trying out my messaging on climate technology to different audiences, and I just have to watch carefully, and it doesn't always work. And I just say, okay, next time it's going to be better.
And that's where common ground comes in too. I mean, I know you've really evolved your message to be around jobs in a lot of arenas, because that's something that people can get behind when you talk about new climate technologies.
Yeah, I mean, my science is fundamentally supported by the government, but I work very much with private interests. And so, what are the overlaps today between those two interests? Jobs. I can always open a conversation by talking about that, and then I get a sense of where the person is and where they're likely to go.
I think that may be it for our questions, unless we've...
We're new at this interface, so okay, we've got more questions. Okay. How do you find opportunities to connect with non-traditional funders? I have not seen many of them at my usual conferences and events. You haven't seen them because they're hiding in the back. But the funny thing is, if you walk up to somebody and say, hi, I'm Roger, I'd like to know what are you interested in? What are you doing here? You'll find all kinds of people like that. And particularly in my work in climate, they're all over the place today. And of course they do drift in and out of topics, but being comfortable with just saying, I'd like to know what you find interesting about this, or I'd like to know why you came to this conference. That's a really safe conversation for anyone. VCs are different. You don't expect to run into a venture capitalist and just make a pitch to them at a conference. You are far better off asking other people who've worked with them, reading their webpage, finding out what they're interested in, and then arranging a meeting, having an email conversation with them and say, I'm interested in finding out whether you're interested in this topic. And they'll have a conversation with you, and ultimately you'll end up in the canonical hour-long business pitch with them. But generally a more formal approach for venture capitalists is effective.
And also, with the internet today, it's so easy to do research and find out what various nonprofit organizations are doing. I mean, I know just in the last couple of months, you were asked to be at that X Prize session to help figure out a prize to help inspire more climate technology. And, when you start to find your way into, there's a community. And if you can find your way in, you can start to identify the people who are giving money. But a lot of the major foundations are taking on important problems these days. So a little bit of online research can get you started. And don't be afraid to reach out to people. If you're able to identify someone on LinkedIn or through, there are a couple of different directories of nonprofit organizations. If you're able to identify people, take that common ground approach in an email. I mean, the reason that Laura and I connected is I sent her a message. I talked about our common interests and asked if I could have a little of her time. Like Roger said, asking for advice is a great way to get people to give you a few minutes of their time. So those are some other techniques that might be helpful.
So second question we have is, do you have any guidelines on how to do a deep dive on one subject? How do you not say too much? Constraining yourself to one view graph is a really good thing to lock yourself in, because it's easy to imagine that you're telling the entire story, and you don't want to. You want to tell the important part of the story. And at the same time, you want somebody in the audience who's an expert to understand what you're doing. So, showing a graph with results and taking the time to explain it can be a good way to do that. But in general, you want to think one slide. And if you need 2 or even 3, that's fine. But tell yourself the goal is 1, and then you won't say too much. Most people are very tolerant of us scientists giving them more information than they need. They'll give us a little bit of slack.
And the other advice I would give on that point is ask yourself, what's my message? What do I really need to communicate with this deep dive? What's the most important thing for the technical people to understand at a technical level? And what impression do I want to leave on my decision maker? What do I want them to think? What do I want them to feel? What do I want them to do as a result of hearing these? So think about your message. That also helps you constrain the amount of information that you give.
Yeah, many times scientists go into a presentation without a clear idea of what their message is. I hate to say it, but their message is often, look at all the work I did.
Or at least that's how it shows up.
and that's not a useful message for a decision maker. You wouldn't be there. You wouldn't have gotten their time if they didn't think that you were a scientist who was useful and had good ideas. So you don't want to drown them with all the things that you've done. You want to tell them what you found. You want to tell them what the important conclusion is that you reached. You really very rarely need to tell them how you reached that conclusion. Just tell them what the conclusion is.
And that looks like the end of the questions that we have. So we really appreciate you being here with us today. It's been delightful spending this time with you, and go out into the world. Remember to be self-aware and self-correcting, and to recognize that as you build trusted relationships, that will go a long way in helping you stand out and advance your science. And we just want to say thank you again for inviting us to be part of this. It's been delightful collaborating, and we love the work you do and are just delighted to know that you've been able to reach so many scientists, helping them to be more effective communicators.
Absolutely. The feeling is mutual, Roger and Amy. This is a great collaboration. Thank you for your time. And yes, so please go check out our website, and we will also be sending out an evaluation form to all those who signed up. So please do take a few minutes to respond back to us.
We have to hand it back.
Yeah.
We have to
Thank you so much for your time.